Imagine a teenager who never wanted to stand out, a quiet black boy, traveling alone in first class, his biggest wish to blend in and enjoy the seat he earned. But what happens when silence isn't enough to protect your dignity? What would you do if the very people meant to ensure your comfort looked straight through you? Would you speak up, or let the world move on? In this story, a single flight becomes a battleground for belonging. When a flight attendant's careless spill becomes a symbol of something far deeper, the everyday ways people are made to feel invisible. Why did no one speak up? What hidden stories do we all carry in our silence? And how much power does it take sometimes just a single text message to make the whole system stop and pay attention? You won't believe how one boy's quiet resistance changed the lives of every passenger and forced an entire industry to reckon with itself. If you're ready for a story that will challenge you, move you, and make you question what you'd do in Seat 2A, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin the journey. The sound of the airport was a mixture of tired voices, rolling suitcases, and the mechanical beep of boarding calls echoing down a brightly lit corridor. For Jordan Ellis, everything felt sharper, louder, as if the world itself was reminding him this wasn't home turf. He moved carefully through the line at gate 28, holding his navy duffel with both hands, the boarding pass creased and soft from the ride in his pocket. He paused, adjusted his jacket, and looked up at the display. Astrafly Airlines Flight 3398 Denver to New Haven. His seat was 2A first class. He whispered it under his breath as if saying it might make it more real. The line shifted forward. Jordan followed, shoulders drawn in, careful not to brush anyone. He was aware of every glance, every flicker of attention. He wasn't the only teen at the airport, but here in this line, surrounded by expensive luggage and tailored coats, he might as well have been the only one who'd ever sat in first class. "Good morning. Welcome aboard," said the gate agent, not looking up from her scanner. Jordan handed over his ticket and tried to smile. The beep was soft. She gestured him forward. The jet bridge felt colder than the terminal. Jordan's palms were damp. He glanced at his phone, hoping for another message from his mom, Ms. Nadine Ellis, but the only thing on the screen was her last text. "Be yourself. Joe, I'm so proud of you." He let the words settle. Then he stepped onto the plane. The first-class cabin was nothing like he'd pictured. The air was scented with something citrusy, leather and lemon wipes. The seats were wider than he expected, and the carpet so clean it made his sneakers feel out of place. A flight attendant stood at the doorway. She was tall, with ice-blonde hair and a neat chignon, her uniform crisp and blue. She wore her name badge pinned perfectly, Rebecca Sloan. Ms. Sloan's smile flickered. "Welcome," she said, then turned to help another passenger. Jordan nodded, but she didn't see. He found his seat 2A, window. The headrest was soft. The seat controls gleamed with chrome. He eased his bag beneath the seat, careful not to scuff the spotless metal. For a moment, he just sat, breathing in the unfamiliar space, letting his eyes trace the curve of the wing outside. A man in a gray suit was already in 2B. He glanced at Jordan, then looked away. Across the aisle, an elderly woman with silver hair, Eleanor Page, offered Jordan a gentle smile. He nodded back, uncertain, grateful. She looked like someone who'd spent a lifetime making people comfortable. As more passengers filtered in, the cabin began to fill with quiet voices and the soft shuffle of newspapers. Jordan watched them settle, each with practiced ease, as if first class was as ordinary as any city bus. For him, this was something else. He tucked his hands under his thighs to keep them still. He thought about how he'd gotten here. Last week, he'd won the state's Young Writers' Prize, a surprise even to himself. The award ceremony was in New Haven, and his mom's best friend, Dr. Samuel Carter, had insisted that a writer needed a real adventure to remember. Dr. Carter had called the airline, pulled a few strings, and upgraded Jordan's ticket. "You belong up front," he'd said over dinner, his eyes warm and serious. "Don't ever let anyone act like you don't." Jordan tried to believe him. But now, here, he felt that old tension settling into his chest. He glanced down at his phone, scrolling through old texts for comfort. His mom's words glowed on the screen. He pressed the power button, letting the cabin's hush take over. "Ms." Sloane began her walk down the aisle. She moved quickly, checking overhead bins, smoothing stray magazines, her heels landing softly on the carpet. When she reached Jordan's row, she paused, her gaze just grazing him. "Settle in, please," she said, her tone brisk. Jordan nodded. The man beside him ignored them both, already deep into a spreadsheet on his laptop. Jordan looked out the window, watched the tarmac workers in their neon vests wave batons and drive baggage carts in careful circles. He became aware of a new arrival. Chris Nguyen, a younger flight attendant, came down the aisle with a welcoming smile and a stack of menus. He stopped by Jordan's seat. "Good morning, sir. Would you like a breakfast menu?" Chris's voice was gentle, not forced. Jordan blinked, surprised, and took the menu. "Thank you." Chris smiled again before moving on. The interaction was so simple, so normal, that it almost calmed Jordan. Almost. A few rows back, Jordan could hear a woman complaining quietly about her seat. "It's not by the window, ridiculous," she muttered, her voice sharp. He glanced over, but Chris handled it smoothly, offering her a drink and a reassuring smile. Ms. Sloane came back, distributing water to the front row, asking each person if they wanted coffee or orange juice. Jordan sat up a little, waiting for her to offer him something too. She handed a glass to the man in 2B, asked if Eleanor Page would like water. Then, without a word or a glance, she skipped Jordan's seat entirely and moved to the next row. Jordan's face grew warm. For a second, he wondered if he'd misunderstood, if maybe she'd return, but she didn't. Eleanor Page leaned over. Her voice was soft. First flight up front, Jordan smiled, a little embarrassed. "Is it that obvious?" She patted his hand, gentle and non-judgmental. "You're doing fine, sweetheart." He nodded, grateful, but in his stomach, a tightness coiled. Not fear, not quite, but something familiar. He'd felt it at school, at stores, in places where people seemed to need proof before they'd trust him with space. Across the cabin, the businessman in 2B shifted, pulling his briefcase closer. Jordan tried to focus on the seat, on the promise he'd made to his mom to enjoy this flight, to remember every detail for his next story. But already he felt himself shrinking, as if taking up less space might make him invisible. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Marcus Bell. Welcome aboard Astrofly 3398 with nonstop service to New Haven. We'll be departing shortly." Jordan exhaled slowly, tried to let the captain's calm tone settle him. He could do this. It was just a flight, just a seat. He deserved to be here at least, that's what everyone kept telling him. "Miss." Sloane returned, her steps precise. "Tray tables up. Please," she said, and her eyes flicked past Jordan, never quite landing. He complied, folding his hands on his lap. Eleanor Page caught his gaze again. "Let me know if you need anything," she whispered. Jordan nodded, his voice lost somewhere in the roar of his own heartbeat. Outside, the last of the luggage was loaded. The doors closed. Jordan watched the runway lights blur as the plane shifted toward departure. He straightened in his seat, closed his eyes for a moment, and breathed in the strange, lemon-scented air. In a few hours, he'd be in a new city, reading his poem on stage. Maybe then, he thought, he'd finally feel like he belonged at the front. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope. The plane hummed softly as the last passengers settled into their seats. Jordan listened to the quiet shuffle of feet and the slow click of overhead bins closing, the kind of background music that said things were about to begin. His fingers drummed quietly on the armrest. He tried not to look at anyone for too long, worried that any stray glance would invite questions or suspicion. He told himself to relax, to let the comfort of the seat sink in, but the truth was he still felt like an actor in someone else's play. "Ms." Sloane moved briskly through the cabin, straightening blankets and adjusting pillows with an efficiency that looked practiced but not warm. Her hair never moved. Her expression never changed. Jordan caught the way she would pause and smile at some passengers, her voice rising just a note higher for an older gentleman, a touch of sympathy for a tired young mother in row 3. But whenever her eyes flicked over him, the brightness faded. He noticed it, but he wasn't sure anyone else did. Chris Nguyen was different. Jordan saw him move quietly from row to row, a soft smile on his face, offering menus and quietly making sure each passenger had what they needed. Chris greeted Jordan again with a small nod and said, "If you need anything, just push the call button." Jordan nodded, grateful for the brief moment of normalcy. Across the aisle, Eleanor Page was carefully arranging her reading glasses in a small paperback book. She caught Jordan's glance and smiled. "I always bring a novel," she said, her voice low and inviting. "Even though I rarely read more than a page or two on planes, something about the sound of the engines always lulls me to sleep." Jordan smiled politely, the tension in his shoulders easing for just a moment. The pre-flight announcement started. Captain Bell's voice was calm and practiced as he spoke about expected flight time, cruising altitude, and weather conditions in New Haven. For most passengers, these details faded into background noise. For Jordan, every word seemed to matter, as if knowing these small things might help him belong. He took a deep breath, held it, and then let it out slowly. As the safety demonstration began, a well-dressed businessman in the front row leaned back and glanced at Jordan. The man's eyes lingered, a small wrinkle forming on his brow as if trying to place him or solve a puzzle. Jordan met his gaze for a heartbeat, then looked away, pretending to adjust his seatbelt. A few rows back, a little girl pressed her face against the window, excitedly whispering to her father about the clouds. Jordan envied that kind of simple joy. He could barely remember the last time he'd boarded a plane without feeling watched or measured, as if he had to earn the right to be there with every careful movement. The plane began to taxi. "Ms." Sloane made another sweep through the cabin, her heels clicking quietly on the plush carpet. She paused at row 2, checking to see that tray tables were up and seat backs forward. Without a word, she reached across Jordan to smooth out a blanket on Alan Stone's lap, her body almost blocking him from view. Jordan flinched, surprised by how invisible he felt in that moment. He watched as Miss Sloane moved to the next row, her voice suddenly lighter, joking with a pair of frequent flyers about their golf trip. She never joked with him. Eleanor Page leaned over again, her tone almost conspiratorial. "Don't let all this luxury fool you," she said. "Most of these folks are just as anxious as we are. They just have better poker faces." Jordan managed a real smile this time. He wanted to believe her. A few minutes later, as the plane gained speed down the runway and lifted off, Jordan closed his eyes. He focused on the rush in his stomach, that familiar drop that came with takeoff, and for a few seconds he let himself forget about the eyes and the judgments and the invisible lines that seemed to mark out who belonged and who didn't. At cruising altitude, Ms. Sloane returned with a tray of drinks. The glasses clinked softly, the scent of orange and cranberry juice lingering in the air. She began with the businessman, Alan Stone, pouring him a generous glass of sparkling water and offering a compliment about his tie. For Eleanor, she smiled kindly and asked about her book. When she reached Jordan, she hesitated for just a second. He met her eyes, trying to find even a flicker of warmth. There was none. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice flat. Jordan nodded. "Just water. Please." She poured a glass and handed it to him without looking directly at him. Then quickly moved on. Chris Nguyen appeared behind her with a basket of snacks, offering one to Jordan with a smile. "Pretzels or almonds?" Chris asked. "Pretzels, thank you." Jordan tried to relax, holding on to the small acts of kindness that seemed to come only from the young attendant. Across the aisle, Jessica Lee, a woman in her early 30s, adjusted her laptop and looked over at Jordan with curiosity. "Headed home or headed to something new?" she asked. Jordan hesitated, then answered. "Going to a poetry competition." Jessica's eyes lit up. "That's amazing. What's your poem about?" Jordan hesitated, always careful not to overshare, then simply said, "Belonging, I guess." Jessica nodded, understanding more than she let on. "We all spend our lives searching for that, don't we?" The conversation was brief but meaningful. Jordan realized how rare it was for someone to see him as something other than a question mark. As Jessica turned back to her work, Jordan opened his backpack and pulled out his own battered notebook, flipping through pages covered in neat handwriting and ink blots. As meal service began, the division between first class and the rest of the plane felt even sharper. White tablecloths appeared, menus were handed out, wine was offered. Ms. Sloane moved from seat to seat, her attention a currency she distributed carefully. Jordan noticed how the businessman received 2 options for appetizers, while he was handed one with a simple chicken or vegetarian. He chose vegetarian, trying to keep his tone even, not wanting to give anyone a reason to see him as difficult. When the food arrived, it was placed carefully in front of Alan, then Eleanor, and finally, with a small sigh, Ms. Sloane set Jordan's tray down with the faintest clatter. No words, no eye contact. Eleanor Page noticed. She gave Jordan a questioning look, but he shook his head, not wanting to make a scene. He had learned a long time ago that drawing attention to these small slights only made things worse. Still, inside, a frustration grew. After the meal, the cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers closed their eyes or pulled out books. Ms. Sloane moved quietly between rows, making small talk with some, ignoring others. When she returned to Jordan's seat, it was to collect his tray. She reached across him again, brushing his arm, and he stiffened involuntarily. She didn't notice or pretended not to. Instead, she turned to Eleanor Page and whispered, "Is your neighbor all right? He seems a little tense." Eleanor's lips thinned, and she replied just loud enough for Jordan to hear, "He's fine. He's exactly where he's supposed to be." The words settled over Jordan like a blanket. He felt seen, even if only by one person. Jordan stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by. His reflection in the glass looked older somehow, more tired than when he'd boarded. He wondered what his mom would say if she were here, what Dr. Carter would advise. Probably to hold his head high, not to give in to frustration. But as the hours stretched on, he couldn't shake the sense of being tested, of every action being weighed. At one point, as he got up to use the restroom, a passenger in row 4 stopped him. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone sharp. "Are you sure you're supposed to be up here?" Jordan blinked, taken aback. "Yes, my seat is 2A." She looked skeptical, but after a beat, let him pass. When he returned, Chris was waiting near his seat, a reassuring presence. "Everything okay?" Chris asked quietly. Jordan nodded, but inside he wasn't sure. Back in his seat, Jordan tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. He found himself replaying every interaction, wondering if he'd done something wrong, if maybe he really didn't belong. The lines that divided first class from the rest of the plane weren't as sharp as the lines that divided who felt welcome and who didn't. As the plane cruised through the night, Jordan pressed his forehead to the window and let the cold seep into his skin. The sky outside was endless, dark, and silent. Somewhere far below, the world moved on, uncaring. Up here, in seat 2A, he was just a boy with a notebook, trying to carve out a space for himself in the air. In the quiet, he whispered to himself, "You're supposed to be here." He said it again, softer this time, as if the words themselves might build a wall strong enough to keep the doubts away. But even as he repeated them, he wondered if anyone else on this plane believed it. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but the lines he couldn't see kept him awake. Clouds drifted outside the window, pale gold in the afternoon sun, as Jordan tried to lose himself in the view. But the comfort was temporary. His mind kept wandering back to each small interaction, each sideways glance or unspoken question. The soft rumble of the engines was a background to his thoughts, a reminder that up here there was no escape, nowhere to blend into the crowd. You were seen or you weren't, and sometimes being seen was the hardest part. The cabin had settled into a familiar rhythm. Passengers in first class leaned back in their seats with the relaxed confidence of frequent flyers, requesting another glass of wine or a warm towel. Ms. Rebecca Sloane glided from row to row, a polished figure in navy blue, her smile brightening for some and barely flickering for others. She checked on the businessman Alan Stone, pausing to discuss the latest stock market news, and she bent down to chat with a mother and her toddler near the back of the cabin, her voice growing softer and sweeter. When she reached Jordan's row, something in her posture changed. The warmth faded, replaced by a brisk efficiency. She looked past him to the window, adjusting the shade as if he weren't there at all. Jordan felt his pulse skip. He wondered if maybe he was imagining things, if perhaps she was just tired, or if he was just too sensitive, reading too much into every small slight. Chris and Nguyen moved down the aisle with a tray of drinks, quietly refilling glasses and offering gentle words to passengers. Chris had a way of making even the smallest gesture feel like an act of care. When he reached Jordan, he leaned in and asked, "Would you like anything else? Mr. Ellismore pretzels, maybe some juice." Jordan managed a small smile, grateful for the kindness. "Cranberry juice, please. Thank you." Chris nodded, then disappeared toward the galley. A few minutes later, Ms. Sloane returned, this time balancing a tray crowded with drinks and napkins. Her steps were quick and deliberate, her jaw set. She moved down the row, stopping to pour sparkling water for Alan Stone, handing Eleanor Page a cup of tea with a gentle touch. Jordan sat up a little straighter, brushing invisible crumbs from his tray table, determined to meet her with the same calm composure he'd practiced all his life. When she arrived, Ms. Sloane didn't look at him. She barely paused. Her hand reached across the tray, searching for the right glass. In that small, careless motion, something shifted. The edge of the tray dipped, and before Jordan could react, a full glass of cranberry juice tipped and spilled, its contents rushing in a cold, sticky wave across his lap, soaking his pants, his shirt, and the notebook in his hands. For a split second, the whole world seemed to freeze. The sound of the ice cubes hitting the tray, the sharp intake of breath from the row behind, the jolt of cold against his skin, all of it happened at once, and then time snapped back into place. "Oh, dear." "Ms." Sloane said, her voice high and theatrical. "I'm so sorry." But she didn't meet his eyes. She set the tray down, grabbed a handful of napkins, and placed them with a soft thud on his tray table. "Here, you'll want to clean that up before it stains." Jordan looked down at his hands, the juice dripping from his fingers, pooling on the edge of his ruined notebook. The red stain spread across the pages, turning his careful handwriting into a blurred mess. His cheeks burned with embarrassment. He reached for the napkins, trying to mop up the mess as best as he could, but the juice had already soaked through the fabric. Alan Stone glanced over, his face impassive, before turning back to his phone. Eleanor Page leaned toward Jordan, her voice a gentle hush. "Let me help you with that." She handed him a clean handkerchief, her hands steady. Jordan shook his head, mumbling a quiet "thank you" as he tried to regain his composure. Ms. Sloane was already moving away, her attention shifting back to the other passengers as if nothing had happened. The businesslike mask slid smoothly back into place. She didn't offer water, didn't ask if he needed to change clothes, didn't even ask if he was okay. To her, it was just another spill, another minor inconvenience in a long day. Jordan pressed the napkins into his lap, feeling the cold and the stickiness, the humiliation sinking deeper than the stain. His fingers shook, not from the chill, but from the sense of being exposed. He had done everything right. He hadn't asked for anything special, hadn't made a scene. And yet, here he was soaked, uncomfortable, and alone. A few rows back, Chris Nguyen noticed the commotion. He paused, concern etching his face, but Miss Sloane caught his eye and shook her head with the faintest warning. Chris hesitated, then moved on, his expression troubled. Jordan sat perfectly still, trying not to let the emotion show. The world had gone back to normal as quickly as it had changed. The businessman was back to reading emails. The little girl near the window was giggling at her father's attempts to draw a cartoon. Even Eleanor Page, for all her kindness, eventually settled back into her book. Jordan looked at his hands, stained red. He thought of texting his mom. But what would he say? That he'd been treated like he didn't belong, even when he did nothing wrong, that he wished he could disappear, just for a moment, so no one would have to see the mess. He swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. Inside, the conflict burned. Should he speak up? Should he call Chris? Ask for help? But every lesson he'd learned told him to keep his head down, to let the moment pass. Making noise would only make things worse. He pictured the faces of his teachers, the warnings to not cause a scene. He remembered what his mother always said, "You have to be twice as good, twice as careful." That weight settled on him, heavier than the spill. He stared at his ruined notebook, watching as the ink bled into the pages. Each poem, each carefully written line, was now a blur of color, a reminder that sometimes it took only one careless moment to ruin something you'd worked hard to build. As the minutes ticked by, the cold in his lap turned into a dull ache. The stain dried sticky against his skin. Still, no one said anything. No one stood up. No one called Ms. Sloan back to demand an apology. Eleanor Page caught his gaze again. Her eyes were sad, apologetic. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then thought better of it. She looked away. Jordan breathed slowly, steadying himself. He wiped his hands as best he could and placed the napkins on the tray. He wanted to be invisible. He wanted to shrink so small that no one could see him. But, at the same time, he wanted to stand up and demand respect. The tension inside him grew tighter, a silent scream trapped just beneath his skin. He watched Ms. Sloan in the galley, laughing softly with another attendant. She never once glanced in his direction. Chris Nunuyen came by a few minutes later, whispering, "Are you okay?" Jordan nodded, even though it wasn't true. He remembered Dr. Samuel Carter's advice, spoken quietly one afternoon in the Ellis family kitchen. "If anyone ever makes you feel small," he'd said, "don't let them keep you there. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to speak up." Jordan looked at his phone, hesitating. The temptation was there to send a message, to reach out for help, but he hesitated, afraid of being the problem, of making things worse. What if they said it was just an accident? What if people blamed him for drawing attention? He wiped his hands again and sat back, trying to focus on the rumble of the engines, the quiet drone that meant everything was still moving forward, even when he felt stuck. As the sky darkened beyond the window, Jordan realized he had a choice. He could stay silent, let the moment pass, or he could do anything to claim back a bit of his own dignity. For now, he sat quietly, letting the cold fade, but inside he was anything but calm. Jordan pressed his back into the seat, willing his body to relax, but the sticky cold of cranberry juice clung to his skin, and the embarrassment still radiated from his chest. He stared at the window, the landscape of clouds drifting below, wishing he could dissolve into the sky. The more he tried to become invisible, the more present the discomfort became. He shifted slightly, but the dampness made the fabric tug at his leg and side, reminding him with every move of what had just happened. For a while, the cabin felt silent, though in reality, the background noise of conversation, rustling newspaper, and the hum of engines filled the air. Jordan heard it all through a kind of fog. When he looked up, Ms. Sloane was already chatting with a couple in row 3, her voice pitched bright and pleasant as if nothing had happened at all. Every so often, she'd throw a quick glance in his direction, as if to check whether he'd caused any trouble or started a commotion. But Jordan's stillness was absolute. Across the aisle, Eleanor Page's attention kept drifting from her novel to Jordan. She wanted to say something. He could feel it. There was a tension in her posture, a gentle pressing of lips, the way her thumb paused against the edge of her book. She finally leaned over. "Are you all right, dear?" The question was so simple and so genuine that it almost broke the spell. Jordan looked down, forcing a smile, and nodded. "I'm fine. I just wasn't expecting a cold shower up here." He tried to joke. She didn't laugh. Instead, Eleanor placed her hand softly over his. "You didn't do anything wrong. Remember that, all right?" Her tone was warm but serious. Jordan felt a small comfort settle inside him. He nodded, the words sticking in his throat. Further up the aisle, Alan Stone glanced back at the scene, his expression unreadable. He tapped away at his phone, then folded his arms and closed his eyes, choosing the safety of indifference over involvement. Jordan noticed, as he always did, who looked and who looked away. Jordan dabbed again at his pants, the juice now mostly a sticky memory, but the discomfort lingered. His notebook lay in his lap, the pages drying unevenly, his poetry a watercolor blur. He flipped through, reading half-formed sentences and ink stains. In some way, it felt like a metaphor for every moment he had been overlooked or dismissed in his life, a little accident, a little stain, and everyone else moving on like it never mattered. He thought of texting his mom, Miss Nadine Ellis, but what would he even say? "Hi, Mom. Everything's fine. Just ruined my only dress shirt before the awards." He smiled at the thought, bittersweet and hollow. She would worry. She would call the airline. Maybe that would make things worse. He put his phone away. Instead, he looked at the call button above his head. His finger hovered for a moment, the urge to press it to demand some kind of justice, or at least basic kindness, was strong. But he remembered every warning, every story he'd ever heard about young black men making a fuss in public, about things getting out of hand for no reason at all. His heart pounded at the memory of those stories, of his uncle's advice. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is stay quiet and keep your head down. He wondered why that had to be true. He found himself reflecting on the first time he'd been told to behave in public, how the world had a different set of rules for people who look like him. His mom always said, "You are smart and strong, but you have to be careful. Don't let anyone tell you who you are by how they treat you." Jordan repeated those words in his mind as if they could form a shield. But the sting of the spill had already pierced through. Chris and Nguyen passed by, his eyes darting to Jordan's lap, then to his face. Chris looked like he wanted to say something more, to step in, but Ms. Sloane was hovering in the galley, folding napkins with pointed precision. Chris paused and quietly asked, "Do you want me to bring you some club soda or a towel? We keep stain remover wipes in the back." 2. Jordan shook his head, mumbling, "No thanks, I'm okay." He wasn't sure he believed it, but he didn't want to get Chris in trouble for showing too much sympathy. Chris nodded, eyes apologetic, then moved on. Jordan's mind wandered again, playing through a carousel of doubts. Maybe it really was an accident, he thought. Maybe Ms. Sloane had a long day. Maybe she treated everyone this way. He glanced at Eleanor, who was sipping tea with a steady hand. Eleanor had watched the whole thing. She hadn't spoken up right away, but she was watching now. Jordan wondered if she'd tell her family about this, if he'd become just another small story told over dinner. You wouldn't believe what I saw on my flight today. Or maybe she'd forget it, the way so many people forgot these little moments. As the cabin lights shifted to a soft blue glow for the afternoon, Jordan tried to find a distraction. He scrolled through his phone, reading the program for the Poetry Award ceremony. He stared at the name list, imagining how it would feel to walk on stage in a wrinkled, stained shirt. Would anyone care? Would they notice? Would it become another small thing that turned into a big story for the wrong reasons? He looked over at Eleanor again, and this time she smiled, slow and sad. She whispered, "Some people don't know how to treat others with kindness, but that's on them, not on you." He nodded, grateful for the gentle encouragement, but still unsure if it was enough. Moments later, Ms. Sloane returned to check on the rest of the cabin, her posture rigid and professional. She glanced at Jordan, her expression unreadable. He felt her eyes pass over him, searching for any sign of complaint, any reason to report him as a disruption. But Jordan just looked down at his lap, hands folded, the perfect image of quiet compliance. He wanted to say something. He wanted to make her look him in the eye and see the hurt, the small injustice, but the words tangled inside his throat. Instead, he focused on the sound of the engines, the vibration of the plane, the way the light flickered on the seat in front of him. For the next half hour, Jordan retreated into himself. He replayed the scene over and over. He thought about his poetry, the way he tried to use words to carve space for himself, to name the things others ignored. Maybe, he thought, this was just another story, another line in the notebook. Maybe that's all he would ever get from it. A few minutes before the meal service, a different flight attendant, a woman with dark eyes and a calm presence, appeared at his side. Jordan recognized her as Aliyah Safar, the purser. She spoke softly. "Can I get you a fresh shirt from the supply closet? We sometimes keep extras for emergencies." Her kindness startled him. Jordan hesitated, shook his head. "Thank you, but I think I'll be all right." She nodded, understanding more than he said. "If you change your mind, just let me know." When she left, Jordan felt a small ripple of relief. At least someone had noticed, had cared enough to offer help. He wondered if Ms. Sloane would be annoyed at Aliyah for overstepping. The rules of the air seemed invisible, but he could feel them everywhere. Who could speak? Who should stay silent? Whose comfort mattered most? Meal service began again, and Ms. Sloane returned with a tray. This time, she set Jordan's meal down with practiced indifference, never meeting his eyes. He looked at the food but barely tasted it. Every bite felt like a reminder that he was here on borrowed time, that any mistake might be the one that got him noticed for the wrong reason. Eleanor Page ate quietly, every now and then glancing at Jordan, her gaze gentle and protective. She finally spoke, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "I've been flying for 50 years. I've seen the best and the worst of people in these seats. You have more grace than most. Don't ever forget that." Jordan smiled, a real one this time. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. The meal passed in silence. Jordan found himself growing tired. He let his eyes close for a few minutes, drifting in and out of light sleep, haunted by the memory of the spill and the sense of being both seen and ignored. When he woke, the cabin was quiet. Chris had dimmed the lights, and Eleanor was napping, her book closed on her lap. Jordan stared at the ceiling, feeling the thrum of the engines deep in his chest. He wondered how many people on this plane had ever felt this kind of invisible weight. How many had learned to carry it without complaint? He looked at his phone again, thumb hovering over Dr. Carter's contact. The urge to reach out, to say what had happened, to let someone else hold the burden for just a moment, was strong. But he hesitated, uncertain. Would Dr. Carter tell him to stay quiet? Or would he say it was time to be heard? Jordan breathed deeply, his hands finally steady. He looked out the window at the endless sky, searching for a sign, any sign that he was doing the right thing. The clouds below stretched for miles, their shadows drifting across the earth. Jordan wondered what it would feel like to soar above it all, free of the lines and the stains and the rules that seemed to hold him down. For now, he waited, silent but restless. Somewhere in the hush of the cabin, a decision was taking shape. Jordan didn't know what he would do next, but he knew that staying invisible wouldn't make the hurt go away. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to take up a little more space. Jordan sat in the soft half-light of the first-class cabin, feeling the pressure building inside him, every muscle tense beneath his borrowed dress shirt. The plane was quiet except for the gentle clatter of cutlery and the soft rustle of newspapers, but inside his mind, a storm was gathering. He kept replaying the moment of the spill, the look on Ms. Sloane's face, the sharp sting of being dismissed. The memory swelled, then receded, then swelled again, like a bruise you can't ignore. He tried to distract himself by watching the clouds again, but the reflection in the glass showed the streaks on his shirt and the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if he could shrink from view. He felt both exposed and invisible at once. When he closed his eyes, he heard again his mother's voice, gentle but insistent. "You belong wherever you go. Joe, you don't have to disappear for anyone." He let those words echo through him, an anchor in the shifting sea of doubt. Eleanor Page woke from her nap and adjusted her glasses. She smiled at Jordan and offered a small chocolate from her purse, like a grandmother easing a child's worries. "Thank you," he whispered, the sweetness of brief comfort. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the rhythm of travel smoothing the edges of the moment. But beneath that calm, Jordan's mind spun. He remembered the way Ms. Sloane had glanced at him, the coldness in her tone, and the way the others had looked away, choosing not to get involved. He had learned to let small things go, to tell himself they were accidents, nothing personal. But sometimes, like now, the sum of all those moments was too much to ignore. He looked at the napkins still piled on his tray, sticky with dried juice. He looked at his ruined notebook. He felt the sting of the stain, not just on his clothes, but on his confidence, his sense of place in the world. He wished for a moment he could be someone else, somewhere else, untouched by the weight of judgment. Chris Nguyen appeared again, clearing trays and offering coffee refills. He paused by Jordan's seat, his voice just above a whisper. "If you need to change, let me know. We do have extra shirts in the supply closet." Jordan shook his head, giving Chris a grateful look. Chris didn't move on right away. He hesitated, then leaned in. "For what it's worth, I saw how she treated you. That's not how it's supposed to be. I'll make a note for the report." Jordan nodded, and Chris gave him a subtle squeeze on the shoulder before moving along. For the first time all flight, Jordan felt like maybe, just maybe, someone was on his side. The meal service ended. Ms. Sloan announced over the intercom that the cabin would be dimmed for rest, and she encouraged passengers to close their window shades. Jordan didn't move. He stared straight ahead, gripping his phone tightly. The urge to say something, to do something, had reached its breaking point. He scrolled to Dr. Samuel Carter's name. Dr. Carter had been there for Jordan and his mother after his father passed, helping them navigate everything from scholarships to scholarships, always steady and unflappable. Carter's words still rang in Jordan's mind. "If anyone makes you feel small, don't let them shrink your world. You come to me first." Jordan hesitated. He could feel his heart pounding as he typed out a message. The words were simple but heavy with everything he couldn't say out loud. "Dr. Carter, I'm on the plane. The flight attendant spilled juice on me. Didn't apologize, just told me to clean it up. It wasn't an accident." He hovered over the send button, questioning himself. Was he making too much of it? Was it really worth telling someone? But then he remembered the look on Ms. Sloane's face, the way she skipped him in service, the way she moved around him as if he didn't exist. He remembered the stories Dr. Carter had told him, the battles he'd fought for other kids in schools and public spaces, the way silence had always been the greatest ally of injustice. Jordan pressed send. The message whooshed away, and Jordan set the phone down, hands trembling. The act of reaching out felt both frightening and relieving. It was like opening a window in a room that had grown too small. A few minutes passed. Jordan tried to read, tried to pretend he was only thinking about his poem, but every sound in the cabin felt amplified. His phone buzzed softly. He glanced down, heart leaping. The message was from Dr. Carter. Did she do it on purpose? The text read. Jordan's hands shook as he typed his reply. "She didn't look sorry. She ignored me before that, too. No one else got treated like that." The response was almost instant. Flight number Jordan quickly checked his boarding pass. Fingers still sticky. Astrafly 3398. He added the gate number, feeling the reality of the moment harden in his chest. There was a longer pause, then Dr. Carter's final reply. "Stay in your seat. Don't talk to her again. I'll handle it." Jordan stared at the words, both reassured and anxious. He trusted Dr. Carter completely. But now there was no turning back. The message was out there. He couldn't pretend nothing had happened. The rest of the cabin had no idea that a small act of courage was unfolding quietly in Seat 2A. Ms. Sloane continued her rounds, her professional smile never slipping. Alan Stone scrolled through his phone, unfazed. Jessica Lee worked on her laptop, earbuds in. Eleanor Page watched Jordan carefully, sensing the undercurrent of tension. Up in the cockpit, Captain Marcus Bell had just finished his safety checks when a call from the ground came through his headset. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Captain Bell, hold your position. Do not taxi. FAA is placing a compliance hold on your aircraft, effective immediately. A passenger concern has been escalated internally." Captain Bell was a man who had seen almost everything in his decades flying commercial routes. Delays for weather, emergencies, maintenance, you name it. but a direct FAA compliance hold before takeoff was something he had only heard about in training scenarios. He responded with a simple "understood" and glanced at his co-pilot, Brent, whose eyes were wide. No announcement went out at first. The engine stayed quiet. The sense of anticipation in the cabin was subtle but growing. People glanced at their watches. Some sighed. Others began to speculate quietly. Jordan noticed the shift before anyone else. The crew grew restless, consulting quietly at the galley. Chris Nyan made a quick pass through the cabin, checking on passengers, then disappeared behind the curtain. Ms. Sloane's eyes narrowed when she saw Chris whispering to another attendant, but she kept her smile in place. Eleanor Page leaned toward Jordan and asked softly, "Is something going on?" Dear Jordan shook his head, unsure what to say. He looked out the window, trying to calm his breathing. He watched as the airport tarmac glowed under the afternoon sun. Planes landing and taking off in a rhythm that seemed both comforting and out of reach. His own plane, though, was frozen in time, a liminal space between sky and ground. At the front of the cabin, Ms. Sloane approached the cockpit with quick, controlled steps. She rapped softly on the door, her expression tight. The captain emerged for a moment, listened to her low questions, and simply shook his head. She returned to the galley, her face pale. Jordan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a short message from Dr. Carter. "I've notified the FAA's Civil Rights Office. You don't have to do anything else, just wait for a moment." Jordan felt the full weight of the moment settle over him. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't caused a scene. But his voice, delivered in silence through a single text, had already shifted the balance of the entire flight. All he could do now was wait and trust that this time, someone was truly listening. In the strange stillness that filled the cabin, time seemed to slow. Jordan felt it in the way the light slanted through the windows, catching flecks of dust that floated in the air. For the first time since he'd boarded, he noticed how tense the space had become. The usual energy of departure, the hustle, the anticipation had shifted into a restless waiting. The hum of idle conversation faded as people grew aware that something was not quite right. Jordan kept his gaze forward, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He tried to look calm, but inside, a nervous tremor raced through him. It was a familiar feeling, the sensation that something big was happening just beneath the surface. His phone lay face down on his tray table, the last message from Dr. Carter echoing in his mind. "Stay in your seat. Don't talk to her again. I'll handle it." At first, most passengers noticed nothing unusual. A businessman in row 3 sighed and scrolled through emails, assuming the delay was just another inconvenience of modern travel. Jessica Lee, her earbuds in, kept typing away at her laptop, oblivious. Eleanor Page glanced at her watch, concern starting to line her brow. But Jordan could feel the tension building, like pressure behind a dam. The flight crew moved quietly, whispering in the galley and glancing toward the cockpit. Chris Nguyen poked his head out several times, his expression growing more serious with each pass. Even Ms. Sloane's composure began to crack at the edges. She kept straightening napkins and checking the seat map, her movements more abrupt than before. Up front, Captain Marcus Bell remained in the cockpit, reviewing messages from ground control. His co-pilot, Brent, watched him, nervous. "Captain, this is strange. We're not moving. No announcement from dispatch. Bell nodded, not taking his eyes off the console. He'd received another call from the FAA, this time more urgent. Compliance hold remains in effect. Captain, do not open the cabin door, do not taxi, and await the arrival of FAA representatives on the tarmac. Captain Bell understood what this meant. Someone on board had escalated a complaint to the highest levels. He didn't know who or why, but he knew this wasn't the kind of thing that happened over a simple delay or a minor passenger squabble. He took a breath and switched on the cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are experiencing a short delay at the gate and will update you as soon as we have further information. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Jordan listened to the announcement. Heart thudding. He could hear whispers springing up all around the cabin. What's going on? Why aren't we moving? A mother shushed her child, promising they'd be in the air soon. A man in the back row muttered about missing his connection. Ms. Sloane's mask of professionalism slipped for just a moment. She stepped into the aisle, her smile brittle. I do apologize for the inconvenience. Everyone. We're working to resolve a minor issue. Please remain seated and enjoy some refreshments. Her words floated through the cabin, but her tone didn't match her face. Chris Nguyen glanced at Jordan as he moved by, a silent question in his eyes. Jordan shook his head, grateful for the unspoken support, but not ready to speak. The silence between them felt charged, like an electric current that ran underneath the polite surface of the flight. Back at his seat, Jordan struggled with his own doubts. He wondered if he had made a mistake by reaching out to Dr. Carter. Was this all really his fault? Would people blame him for the delay? He imagined headlines, teen causes flight disruption over spilled drink. His stomach churned. Was it worth all this trouble just to stand up for himself? Would anyone actually believe him as these thoughts spun through his mind? He caught a glimpse of Eleanor Page watching him. She must have read the worry on his face, because she reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. You did the right thing, she whispered. Don't let them make you feel otherwise. Jordan nodded, but his mind was tangled in knots. He thought of the times at school when teachers had dismissed him, or the way store clerks sometimes followed him through aisles, all because they made assumptions about who he was. He remembered how Dr. Carter had taught him to hold his ground, but the lesson always felt heavier in practice. A movement at the front of the cabin drew his attention. Ms. Sloane was standing near the cockpit, speaking quietly with Aaliyah Safar, the purser. Their faces were tense, voices hushed. Jordan couldn't hear the words, but the urgency was clear. Ms. Sloane's eyes darted toward Jordan, then quickly away. Aaliyah nodded, then disappeared into the galley. Meanwhile, Chris returned with a tray of water and quietly offered Jordan a fresh napkin. This time, his voice was even softer. If anyone asks you questions, just tell the truth. Okay, Jordan looked up, surprised. Did you hear something? Chris shook his head. Not really, but I can feel something's about to happen. Just don't be afraid. Jordan took a slow breath. He felt both exposed and cared for, a confusing mixture that made his throat tighten. The minutes stretched on. People started to grow restless. Alan Stone, the businessman, finally put down his phone and rang the call button. Ms. Sloane appeared, her smile forced. Any word on departure, he asked, his tone brisk. Not yet. Mr. Stone, we appreciate your patience, Ms. Sloane replied, then hurried away. Near the rear of the plane, A few passengers began speculating about a security issue. A rumor spread that there was a technical problem with the jet bridge. No one guessed the real reason. Back up front, Captain Bell's radio crackled again. "This is FAA operations. Compliance officer arriving at your aircraft in 10 minutes. Please prepare to remain at the gate." Bell relayed the message to his crew, instructing them to keep the cabin calm and maintain order. The sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. Jordan's phone buzzed once more. Dr. Carter had written, "The FAA is involved now. Everything you told me will be reviewed. You're not alone." Jordan read the message again and again, his hands shaking, feeling a surge of relief but also new anxiety. This was bigger than him now. Ms. Sloane walked past his row, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second longer than before, her lips pressed together. And for the first time, Jordan saw something like worry flicker across her face. He wondered if she realized just how much things had changed. A few minutes later, the cabin phone rang, and Ms. Sloane answered, nodding quickly as she listened. When she hung up, she approached Aaliyah and Chris, her voice urgent but low. "There's a compliance officer coming on board. They'll want to speak to the crew and to passengers. Be ready." Chris shot a quick glance at Jordan, his concern obvious. Aaliyah nodded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flickered to Jordan as well. As the reality settled over the cabin, Jordan felt a shift in himself. The feeling of powerlessness began to ebb, replaced by a quiet determination. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time, he wasn't ashamed. He was just tired of pretending that these small slights were nothing, tired of shrinking to fit the comfort of others. Passengers began to notice the flurry of activity at the front. Whispers darted back and forth. "Why is the captain talking to the flight attendant so much? Are we in trouble?" Someone wondered aloud if they would miss their connecting flight. The mood, once bored and complacent, was now tense and buzzing with speculation. As the compliance officer's arrival drew near, Jordan felt a strange sense of calm. He glanced at Eleanor Page, who offered him a nod of reassurance. "You're not alone," she mouthed. Jordan looked down at his hands, still stained faintly pink from the juice. He traced the lines of his palm, remembering every moment that had brought him here. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He never had, but sometimes the world left you no choice. A few seats away, Ms. Sloane pressed her hands together, staring straight ahead. For the first time since boarding, she looked unsure, even afraid. Jordan sat straighter in his seat, his chest rising with a steady breath. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain: he would not let himself disappear. The minutes ticked by, and the pressure in the cabin built higher. Outside, Jordan saw a black SUV pulling up next to the jet bridge. Two uniformed figures stepped out, their presence unmistakable even from a distance. The moment of reckoning had arrived. When the compliance officers finally arrived, the cabin fell into a hush that was different from ordinary travel silence. This time, it was the stillness of an audience about to witness something that would change the story for everyone in the room. Jordan watched through the first-class window as the black SUV idled on the tarmac. Two figures emerged, one in a navy suit and another in a crisp FAA uniform. They walked with calm purpose to the jet bridge. Their presence alone shifted the gravity of the cabin, and even those passengers who had been grumbling or ignoring the delay began to sit a little straighter, their gazes darting toward the front. The cabin door clicked open, letting in a cold draft and a ripple of curiosity. Chris Nguyen, standing near the galley, quickly straightened his tie and gave Jordan a look of encouragement. Ms. Sloane hovered at the front, her mask of confidence fraying at the edges. Aaliyah Safar, the purser, stepped forward to greet the officials with measured professionalism, her voice composed and quiet. The lead compliance officer, a woman with short gray hair and a badge on her jacket, introduced herself as Officer Ramona Ray. Her tone was clear but not unkind. "Good afternoon, everyone. We apologize for the delay. We'll be conducting a brief review before departure. Please remain seated and cooperate with the crew." Every passenger in first class seemed to sense that something unusual was happening, even if they didn't know what or why. Alan Stone put away his phone and stared at the officers, his businesslike detachment replaced by open curiosity. Jessica Lee pulled out her earbuds, and Eleanor Page closed her book. Her attention focused entirely on Jordan. Officer Ray and her partner conferred briefly with Captain Bell at the cockpit door, reviewing paperwork and speaking in low tones. Jordan's heart pounded as he realized the events he had set in motion were now much larger than a spilled drink or a ruined notebook. After several minutes, Officer Ray approached the front galley, where Miss Sloane waited with a tense smile. "Miss Sloane, can we speak with you privately in the forward galley?" The officer's request left no room for argument. Ms. Sloane nodded, pale, and followed her out of view. The murmurs among passengers grew louder as the seconds ticked by. "Why are they talking to the flight attendant?" "What's really going on?" a woman in 4C whispered to her husband. "I bet someone important is on this flight." The child in 3A asked her mother if the police were coming. Eleanor Page turned to Jordan and offered her hand. "You're brave," she said softly. "You did the right thing." Jordan didn't answer, but he squeezed her hand gratefully. In the galley, the confrontation was direct. Officer Ray's voice was calm but edged with steel. "Miss Sloane, we've received a complaint about your conduct with a minor passenger in first class. Did you spill a drink on him and fail to apologize, Ms.?" Sloane's composure cracked, her voice trembling as she replied, "It was an accident. I gave him napkins. I was busy with service." Officer Ray continued, "Did you skip him during initial service? Did you document the incident? Did you report it to your supervisor?" Sloane stumbled over her answers. "I was moving quickly. I may have missed him, but I didn't mean any harm." Officer Ray's face did not change. "We have corroborating statements from both crew and passengers. For now, you are to step away from passenger duties. You will apologize to the minor in front of this cabin, and you will be interviewed further after landing. Do you understand, Ms.?" Sloane nodded, her confidence fully evaporated. Back in the cabin, the passengers watched as Officer Ray led Miss Sloane to the center aisle. The tension was electric. Even the children were silent. Miss Sloane stopped next to Jordan's row and looked down at him, her hands folded tightly. Her voice came out small. "Jordan, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. It was careless of me. I regret the inconvenience." For a moment, Jordan didn't move. He looked up at Ms. Sloane, seeing not just a flight attendant but a woman suddenly stripped of her authority and certainty. He thought of all the times he had chosen silence over confrontation. The way he'd convinced himself that patience was easier than standing out. He spoke quietly but clearly. "Do you regret the spill? or do you regret not caring how it made me feel?" His words cut through the stillness. Several passengers shifted, some looking away, others locking eyes with him for the first time. "Ms." Sloane's lips parted, but no words came. Jordan broke the moment by folding his napkin and setting it on his tray. "I think you should go back to your galley now," he said gently, "before more people start paying attention." The room was utterly silent as Ms. Sloane retreated. A sense of recognition settled over the cabin, heavier than any words. Jordan sat back, his heart racing, but with a growing steadiness in his chest. For once, he had not let himself disappear. Officer Ray gave him a nod of respect. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis. You handled that with dignity." She turned to the cabin. "Thank you for your patience and your understanding. We will continue our review and resume the flight shortly." As the officers moved to the front of the plane, Eleanor Page squeezed Jordan's shoulder. "I hope my grandchildren are half as brave as you," she said with a gentle smile. Jordan managed a small smile back, the tension easing, replaced by a new kind of energy. He glanced at Chris and Yin, who nodded his approval from the galley, and at Aliyah Safar, whose face showed pride and relief. Even Alan Stone gave him a brief, respectful nod. Jessica Lee caught his eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Passengers began to whisper again, but the conversation had changed. It wasn't about the delay anymore. It was about what they'd witnessed a teenager who had stood his ground, not with anger or outrage, but with quiet resolve. The compliance officers finished their discussions with the crew and prepared to leave. Officer Ray stopped at Jordan's seat one last time. "We'll need a brief word with you after landing, but for now, you can relax." Jordan nodded, letting the relief wash over him. Outside, the sun was sinking lower, casting gold light across the runway. Inside, the air was different. The balance had shifted. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now respect. Jordan finally allowed himself to breathe. The decision to speak up, to call Dr. Carter, had changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone on board. He watched as Ms. Sloane quietly gathered her things, stepping out of the aisle for the last time. As she passed, she met his eyes with a look that was more complicated than anger or regret. There was fear in it, but also a glimmer of understanding. Jordan realized then that change often came not from loud voices, but from the quiet ones that refused to disappear. And today, in Seat 2A, his silence had become the loudest thing on the plane. As the compliance officers finished their conversations at the front of the cabin, Jordan felt the atmosphere around him change in subtle but undeniable ways. The plane had not moved an inch, yet it was as if the entire aircraft had shifted in its orbit. A moment ago, he was just a boy with juice drying on his shirt and doubt gnawing at his confidence. Now, he was the silent center of attention, a presence no longer easily ignored. People glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking. Some faces showed respect, others discomfort, but none were indifferent anymore. Whispers rippled through first class, not the loud, gossipy kind, but the soft questions and confessions of people realizing they'd just witnessed something important. A woman in 3C murmured to her husband, "I never would have spoken up at that age." The man nodded, not taking his eyes off Jordan. Eleanor Page, having seen enough of human nature in her long life to know when a tide had turned, watched the young man beside her with pride. "Jordan, you know, Sometimes all it takes is for one person to say enough, and everything changes," she whispered. Her words landed softly but carried a weight he could feel. Jordan nodded. He wanted to believe her, but inside, a swirl of emotions made it hard to sit still. Was he relieved, angry, proud, afraid? All of those things and more. He felt exposed, but also oddly stronger, as if a hidden part of himself had finally stepped into the light. A few seats away, Alan Stone put his phone away for the first time since takeoff and regarded Jordan with a thoughtful look. Jessica Lee, usually absorbed in her own world, caught Jordan's gaze and offered an encouraging smile. "You're not invisible anymore," she seemed to say. But the voices in Jordan's head weren't as reassuring. He worried what would happen next. Would the airline retaliate? Or would the story follow him wherever he went? Would people see him only as a victim or as a troublemaker? The sense of responsibility was overwhelming. He longed for his mother, for Dr. Carter's steady voice on the other end of the phone. He wanted to be small again, just a quiet kid on a poetry trip, not a headline waiting to happen. Chris Nguyen returned, crouching beside his seat for a moment, careful to keep his voice low. "You did the right thing. If you need anything at all, you let me know. Okay." There was genuine warmth in Chris's eyes, the kind that made Jordan feel less alone. "Thank you," he said quietly. At the front, Ms. Sloane stood apart from the other attendants, her posture no longer proud or brisk. For the first time, her movements were hesitant, even shaky. She looked down the aisle at Jordan, her face caught between fear and an aching regret. Aliyah Safar stood near her, her presence calm and quietly authoritative, making sure procedures were followed. Aliyah shot Jordan a subtle nod, a silent message of solidarity. It was the longest 30 minutes Jordan had ever experienced. The compliance officers moved through the cabin, interviewing a few passengers. They spoke briefly with Eleanor, who answered with the unflappable dignity of someone who has nothing to hide. They spoke with Chris and Aliyah, both of whom were honest and composed. When Officer Ray finally returned to Jordan's row, she sat beside him, notebook open. "Mr. Ellis, thank you for your patience. Can you tell me in your own words what happened, from your boarding up to now?" Jordan took a breath, feeling Eleanor's gentle support at his side. He recounted everything as simply as he could, being skipped during drink service, the way Ms. Sloane's tray dipped, the cold shock of the spill, the lack of apology, and the feeling of being invisible in his own seat. Officer Ray listened carefully, never interrupting. When he finished, she nodded and closed her notebook. "Thank you for your honesty. You acted with restraint and maturity. If you're comfortable, we'll follow up after landing. But for now, you've done everything right." She offered a reassuring smile, and Jordan felt some of the weight begin to lift from his shoulders. After the officers finished, they made one last announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your cooperation and understanding. We are concluding our review. The crew will prepare for departure, and we will be speaking further with some individuals after landing." The normal rhythm of the flight resumed, but nothing truly felt the same. The silence in the cabin was different now, a quiet charged with awareness. Even the smallest interactions seemed to carry more meaning. Passengers who once avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully as Jordan passed by on his way to the restroom. A mother with a toddler paused and gave him a gentle smile. Alan Stone offered a low, "I hope you have a better rest of your trip." "Son." Back in his seat, Jordan gazed out the window as the plane finally pushed back from the gate. The sun was dipping low, painting the clouds in shades of orange and gold. He watched the light shift, feeling the day's tension slowly giving way to something like hope. He realized then that he had not been alone. Not really. Not with Chris, Eleanor, Aaliyah, and even Officer Ray, all willing to bear witness, to tell the truth. He closed his eyes, letting himself breathe for the first time in hours. He pictured his mother's face, imagined the proud smile she would wear when she heard the story. He imagined Dr. Carter, nodding with that gentle authority that always made the world seem less complicated. He realized that courage didn't always look like shouting or fighting. Sometimes it was just refusing to let yourself be erased. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Eleanor tapped his arm. "Did you ever think your voice could change the whole flight?" Jordan smiled, humbled. "I didn't even want to make noise," he admitted. "Sometimes the world needs to be quiet enough to hear what really matters." Eleanor replied, "And today, everyone heard you." Jordan opened his notebook. The pages still rippled and stained, and wrote a single line. "Today, I did not disappear." He underlined it twice, then closed the book and placed it gently on his tray. Later, as the meal service resumed, Aaliyah Safar delivered Jordan's tray herself. She bent low, speaking softly so only he could hear. "We are all learning. Thank you for reminding us what matters." Her words rang truer than any formal apology could. All around him, Jordan felt the shift. The conversations had changed. People talked more softly, with intention. They checked their own reactions before judging others. Even Ms. Sloane, who kept her distance at the front, seemed chastened and reflective. The flight was only halfway over, but Jordan sensed that the journey was no longer about the destination. It was about what it meant to take up space, to demand acknowledgement, to refuse to let a moment of humiliation define you. As the cabin lights dimmed and night began to fall outside, Jordan finally allowed himself to relax. He leaned his head against the seat, feeling the thrum of the engines, the hum of possibility, and a new sense of peace inside his chest. For the first time, he realized he did not have to become smaller to fit the world. Maybe the world, finally, was learning to make room. By the time the aircraft settled into its cruising altitude, there was a new kind of hush in the cabin. The sky outside was ink blue, streaked with fading gold. For a while, the world below disappeared, the engine hum becoming a blanket over the awkward, weighty memories that filled the air between rows. If anyone thought the tension would fade now that the compliance officers had left the aisle, they were wrong. The silence had deepened, but it was different. It felt like after a thunderstorm, the quiet that follows when people realize they've just witnessed something they cannot forget. Jordan sat still, his hands clasped on top of his notebook. He listened to the rhythm of Eleanor's breathing beside him and the low rumble of Alan Stone's voice as he quietly phoned home to tell his wife there would be a delay. Jessica Lee was typing again, but every few minutes she would stop, look up, and glance at Jordan before returning to her work. Jordan wasn't sure if her look was curiosity, concern, or something else. Maybe it was a kind of apology, the kind you can't say out loud when you know you should have done more. As the first-class lights dimmed to a dusky glow, the rest of the cabin followed suit. Some passengers pulled blankets around their shoulders and tried to nap. Others just stared out the window, lost in thought. The mood had shifted from polite indifference to a reflective caution, like everyone had realized the boundaries of their world had shifted a little. Jordan could feel the ache of the day settling in his shoulders. He closed his eyes for a few minutes, hoping for rest, but the events replayed behind his eyelids. The cold shock of the juice, Ms. Sloane's expression, so quick to harden, so reluctant to soften. The way his own voice had trembled when he finally spoke up. The stillness that followed, not peaceful but charged with consequence. When he opened his eyes again, Eleanor was awake, watching him with a gentle concern that reminded him of his grandmother. She reached into her bag and handed him a soft, monogrammed handkerchief. "For the stains," she said, "or anything else that needs a gentle touch." Jordan accepted it with a grateful smile. He carefully dabbed the last traces of juice from his sleeve and, almost unconsciously, tucked the handkerchief into his breast pocket. As meal service returned, Chris and Guyon arrived with a tray. This time, there was no hesitation. He knelt beside Jordan's seat, his voice quiet enough that only they could hear. "I want you to know, we've documented everything, not just me, but others too. This won't get buried." Jordan nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude and a sense of camaraderie that was rare between passengers and crew. "Thank you, Chris," he said softly. Chris stood and continued down the aisle. Alan Stone cleared his throat, as if debating whether to say something, but finally settled for a simple nod. Jessica Lee, bolder now, leaned over the aisle. "You're stronger than you know," she said. "It's easy to stay silent. Not many people make the world stop to pay attention." Jordan met her gaze, and for a moment, the awkwardness dissolved into understanding. Maybe she really did get it. As the meal progressed, small conversations started up again. Passengers spoke more softly, more thoughtfully, often glancing Jordan's way as if measuring their words. Jordan overheard Alan explaining to his wife that sometimes justice was slow, but today it had moved faster than usual. He wondered if Alan had ever thought about these things before, or if today was the first time. Eleanor tapped her fork against her plate and smiled. "When I was a girl," she said, "my parents told me to keep my head down and let the world pass by. But you made the world stop. That's something to be proud of." Jordan felt a blush rising in his cheeks, but also a new steadiness. It wasn't the pride of proving someone wrong, but of having stood up for himself, however quietly. The hours passed slowly, night deepening outside. Jordan tried to write in his notebook, but the words came out jumbled, his thoughts scattered. At one point, he found himself scribbling lines in the margins I wanted to disappear, but the world wouldn't let me. Now, the world can't unsee me. He stared at the sentence, unsure if it was about him or about everyone on the flight. Halfway through the night, the captain's voice came over the intercom, softer and more human than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience today. We know it has been an unusual journey. The safety and dignity of all our passengers is our highest priority. We hope the remainder of your flight is peaceful." The message, meant for everyone, felt strangely personal. Jordan wondered if the captain knew about everything that had happened. He suspected he did. Eleanor settled in to sleep, her hand resting gently on Jordan's forearm for reassurance. Jordan leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the drone of the engines lull him in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreaming. He found himself back at home, sitting at the kitchen table while his mother stirred sugar into her coffee. Her voice, full of wisdom and warmth, echoed in his memory. "You don't have to fight every battle, Joe, but when you do fight it for the right reason," he clung to that, letting it settle his nerves. Sometime before dawn, Jordan awoke to the feeling of someone watching him. It was Aaliyah Safar, the purser, standing by his row. She crouched down, voice gentle. "I want to thank you," she said. "Sometimes people forget that quiet resistance is its own kind of courage. This crew won't forget." She pressed a small packet of cookies into his hand, the sort of kindness that meant more than any formal apology. Jordan smiled and, for the first time since boarding, felt truly seen. He wanted to say something back, to thank her, but the words failed him. Instead, he nodded, letting the moment speak for itself. Later, as the plane crossed into early morning light, the city lights below flickered and faded. People began to stir, the first signs of a new day arriving with a sense of relief. Jordan realized he wasn't afraid anymore of what might happen when they landed. He had done the hard thing. He had refused to be invisible, even when the world had expected him to disappear. Passengers packed away their things, the small routines of landing beginning. Eleanor carefully folded her blanket. Alan adjusted his tie. Jessica wrote something on her phone, a message, maybe, or a note she wanted to remember. Chris Nguyen passed by and gave Jordan a look of camaraderie, as if sharing a secret that only the two of them could fully understand. When the seatbelt sign illuminated and the crew prepared for arrival, Jordan sat quietly and reflected on everything that had happened. He understood now that standing up for himself was not just about justice for one moment, but about dignity for every moment after. That, he realized, was a victory that could not be undone. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, the city outside brightening with the first sun. In that moment, Jordan felt more awake than he ever had, as if the whole journey had been a kind of awakening not just for him, but for everyone who had been watching. As the plane taxied to the gate, Officer Ray reappeared at the front of the cabin, ready for follow-up interviews. Jordan straightened his shoulders, ready to answer questions, ready to face whatever came next. He was not afraid. He was not alone. The world had seen him, and for once, the world had listened. As the plane rolled gently to the gate, dawn was seeping into the airport windows, lighting the faces of the weary travelers with a soft gold. Jordan sat in his seat, heart beating steady and sure. He could feel the change inside himself, a sense of calm that came from knowing he had not let the worst of the day define him. It was not victory in the way movies promised no applause, no grand speeches, but something deeper, a quiet certainty that he had earned his place. The flight crew made their final checks. Passengers reached for bags and coats. The usual impatience simmered under the surface, but it was different now. Even those who wanted to rush off seemed to hold back a moment, glancing at Jordan with a mixture of curiosity, guilt, and reluctant respect. The story of what happened in first class was already alive in the air between them, passed in looks and quiet conversation. Officer Ray moved efficiently through the cabin, clipboard in hand. She met Jordan's eyes with a reassuring nod and leaned in. "We'll ask you to remain seated when others disembark. Mr. Ellis, we have just a few follow-up questions. You're not in trouble." Jordan nodded, feeling a quiet relief at her steady presence. He did not want attention, but he was no longer afraid of being seen. Chris Nguyen. Sleeves rolled to his elbows now, stopped by Jordan's row one last time. His voice was gentle. "I'll be at the front if you need anything. Thank you for trusting us." Jordan managed a small, grateful smile. It was all he could give after a night that felt endless. Passengers began to rise and gather their things. Some paused near Jordan's seat, unsure if they should speak. Alan Stone, always the businessman, stopped and placed a card on Jordan's tray. "If you ever want an internship at the firm, just say the word. You're the kind of person I'd want on my team." Jordan accepted it, both surprised and touched. Jessica Lee leaned over the aisle, her eyes sincere. "Take care of yourself." Jordan, "The world needs people like you. People who remind us what matters." Jordan nodded, tucking the memory away, letting it settle beside the ache of everything else. Eleanor Page, moving slowly but with purpose, put her hand gently on Jordan's arm. "My grandchildren will hear about you," she said softly. "Not the scandal, but your steadiness. You made the world pause and pay attention. That's rare." Jordan's throat tightened with emotion, but all he could say was, "Thank you for seeing me." One by one, the passengers filed past. A mother with her daughter stopped to hand Jordan a small, folded piece of paper. "Thank you," the mother whispered. "My little girl was watching." The note was simple. "You are brave." Jordan kept it folded in his palm like a secret talisman. As the cabin emptied, Ms. Sloane appeared from the galley. Her eyes were tired, her voice no longer carrying the brittle tone of command. She stopped at Jordan's row, searching his face for forgiveness she was too afraid to ask for. Jordan looked at her, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who had found his own dignity. "Ms." Sloane spoke at last, her words fragile. "I'm sorry for what I did, for what I assumed. I will remember this." She waited, uncertain, but Jordan only nodded. He didn't need to offer more. The lesson was not his to teach anymore. Aliyah Safar, standing near the door, offered Jordan a subtle nod of approval. She had seen everything, had made her own report, and now stood as both witness and ally. Chris Nguyen gave a last thumbs up from the galley, a silent encouragement that warmed Jordan more than he expected. Finally, only the crew, Officer Ray, and Jordan remained. The airport was waking up beyond the glass, vehicles blinking across the tarmac, morning crews preparing for the next journey. The world outside felt bigger and brighter than it had the day before. Officer Ray took the seat across the aisle, flipping open her notepad. "Thank you for your patience. Jordan, we'll keep this brief." She asked him to retell his story, to clarify the sequence, to describe how he felt and what he saw. Jordan spoke plainly, his words now sure and steady. He did not embellish, he did not accuse. He simply told the truth about the juice, the silence, the coldness in Ms. Sloane's eyes, and the small acts of kindness from Eleanor, Chris, and Aliyah. Ray wrote quietly, then closed her notebook and smiled. "We're making a formal report to the airline and the FAA. The process will be transparent. You may be asked for follow-up. Do you have someone meeting you?" "My godfather," Jordan replied, "Dr. Samuel Carter." Ray nodded with recognition. "Good. He's already been briefed." She paused, her face softening. "What you did mattered, Jordan. Not just for you, but for everyone who will sit where you sat. Remember that." Jordan let those words settle. They were heavy but comforting, like a blanket after a long journey. As the gate door finally opened, the last of the cleaning crew began to board. Jordan gathered his bag, carefully placing his notebook and the folded notes inside. He stood up, feeling taller than when he'd boarded. The empty rows were like witnesses to everything that had passed. He stepped into the aisle, flanked by Officer Ray and Chris Nayin. The walk to the door was short, but Jordan felt every pair of eyes in the terminal on him. There was no parade, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement. Some people nodded. A few offered small smiles. The story was already spreading through whispers, through text messages, through glances and silent understanding. Just outside the jet bridge, Dr. Carter stood waiting. He looked tired but proud, his overcoat slung over one arm, eyes searching for his godson. Jordan dropped his bag and, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to accept comfort. Dr. Carter pulled him into a hug, steady and safe. "You did well, Joe," he said quietly. "You stood up for yourself and for everyone who needed you to." Jordan blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. "I was scared," he admitted. "I kept thinking, maybe it was my fault." Carter held him tighter. "The world will always try to tell you to be small. You reminded them that you are not." Officer Ray lingered for a moment, watching the reunion, then stepped forward. "Dr. Carter," she said, "we will be in touch about the next steps." Carter nodded, offering his thanks. The three of them walked together into the terminal, the bustle of morning travelers swirling around them. Jordan felt the exhaustion of the night settle into his bones, but also a lightness, as if a heavy stone had finally been lifted. He had survived the longest flight of his life and had found not just justice, but a new sense of belonging. As they made their way toward baggage claim, Carter handed Jordan a cup of coffee. "You know what happens next?" Jordan shook his head. Carter smiled. "You rest. You let the world catch up to you. And then, if you're ready, you tell your story not because you have to, but because it will help others find their own voice." Jordan nodded, sipping the coffee, letting the warmth fill the space the cold had left behind. The airport around them was coming alive, sunlight flooding the windows, a new day beginning. Jordan looked at his godfather, then at Officer Ray, and finally at the crowds moving past. He realized the story wasn't over. It had just landed. That afternoon, after the airport's morning rush faded and the world outside had brightened into a clear day, Jordan found himself sitting in a quiet waiting area with Dr. Carter. The hum of travelers faded to background noise. For the first time in hours, Jordan felt the world slow down enough for him to take a real breath. He sipped his coffee, feeling the heat soothe his sore throat. Dr. Carter sat beside him, scrolling through his phone, occasionally nodding as if confirming something important. The silence between them was easy, like the kind of silence that comes only after a storm has passed. Jordan watched the parade of people moving through the terminal families. Business travelers, airport workers, and wondered if anyone could guess the story he carried inside. Soon, Dr. Carter received a text from Officer Ray confirming that the FAA report had been filed and that follow-up interviews would happen by video. For now, Jordan was free to go home, to rest, to process. But already the incident was beginning to ripple outward. Carter showed Jordan a few headlines already popping up on news sites: Teens Quiet Resistance Grounds Plane, Sparks National Conversation, Airline Faces Scrutiny After Onboard Bias Complaint. One blog post simply read, "He never raised his voice, but the world heard him anyway." Jordan blinked in disbelief. He hadn't posted a thing. He didn't have social media. Not really. He'd only sent one message, told one trusted adult, and now the whole country seemed to be listening. He glanced at Dr. Carter, unsure whether to feel proud or anxious. Carter gave him a knowing smile. "When you tell the truth, Joe, it moves farther than you think. You can't always control where it goes, but you can be proud you started it." Jordan nodded, remembering the flood of emotions on the plane: fear, embarrassment, determination, relief. It all felt far away now, like he was watching his own life through a window, but he could not deny how changed he felt inside. There was no way back to being invisible. They made their way through the terminal, collecting Jordan's small suitcase and weaving through the crowds. A few people seemed to recognize him, whispering as he passed. Some just offered kind smiles or nods. No one asked for a photo. No one shoved a microphone in his face. It was not fame, just a kind of visibility he'd never known. Outside, the air was cool and clear. Carter's car was waiting. As they drove through the city toward home, Jordan stared out the window, letting the blur of buildings and people flow by. He saw the world differently. Now every crowd, every line, every face seemed filled with their own stories of being seen or overlooked, included or erased. As they neared home, Dr. Carter finally spoke. "You know, Joe, the hardest part of being visible is realizing how many people have never had that chance. Your story will give them permission to stand up, too. You don't owe anyone your story, but you can choose to use it for good." Jordan nodded, but inside, he still struggled. He thought about all the times he'd chosen to let things go: the small slights, the averted eyes, the shrugged apologies that were never given. He wondered if speaking out had been selfish or if it really was the only way to break the cycle. He worried about Ms. Sloan, about whether she would lose her job, whether this moment would become the only thing people remembered about her. Did she deserve redemption? Wasn't that, too, part of dignity? That evening, after a long nap and a hot shower, Jordan sat in his room, his phone buzzing with messages from classmates and relatives. Some had seen the headlines, some just wanted to check in. His mother came home with a hug and a warm meal. She listened quietly as Jordan told the story, not just the facts, but the feelings, the things that never make the news. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she simply said, "I am proud of you. Not because you made news, but because you made yourself heard." That night, the airline issued its first formal statement. It was posted online, and Dr. Carter read it aloud to Jordan. "We acknowledge a serious incident aboard Astra Fly 3398, in which a young passenger was subjected to inappropriate and dismissive treatment by a member of our crew. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities and have placed the crew member on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We apologize unreservedly to Mr. Ellis and his family. This event has prompted immediate review of our policies and training. We are committed to ensuring dignity and respect for every passenger." It was, Jordan thought, the kind of apology that came only when the world was watching. But it was something, and maybe, he hoped, It would be the start of real change. The next day, Dr. Carter's phone rang with an invitation for Jordan to speak privately, via video, with the airline's executive team. Jordan hesitated, nervous. What would he say to the people in charge? Would they really listen? Carter encouraged him. Just tell your truth. You don't owe them a speech. You only owe yourself honesty. During the call, Jordan recounted what happened, just as he had to Officer Ray. He focused on the small things, the feeling of being ignored, the lack of apology, the way kindness from strangers had helped him feel less alone. The executives listened, some of their faces drawn and thoughtful, some defensive. But as Jordan finished, one of them, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, thanked him. You reminded us what it feels like to be on the other side of our policies. We are sorry, and we are listening. Afterward, Jordan felt a strange lightness, as if telling the story again had released something heavy inside him. Dr. Carter patted his shoulder. The first time is always the hardest, but every time you tell your truth, it gets a little easier and a little more powerful. That week, the story was everywhere. It was on news programs, in school assemblies, and discussed in social studies classes. Teachers asked students what they would have done if they'd been there. Some admitted they would have stayed silent. Others said they'd want to do more. At Jordan's own school, the principal called an assembly. He invited Jordan to stand at the front, if he wanted, or just to listen as the principal talked about dignity, courage, and the importance of speaking up for yourself and for others. Jordan stayed in his seat, but he felt every eye turned toward him, not with judgment, but with respect. Ms. Sloane's story appeared, too. A local reporter spoke to her, and her words surprised Jordan. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I let my stress and my biases get in the way of doing my job. I hope to learn from this. I am truly sorry. Jordan felt a pang of sympathy for her, mixed with hope. Maybe, he thought, everyone was learning. One evening, Jordan received a letter from a student across the country. You made me feel like maybe I belong too. Thank you for not disappearing. Jordan held the letter for a long time, thinking about what it meant to be visible in a world that sometimes wants to look away. He realized that being seen was a responsibility, but it was also a gift, a chance to make the world pause and pay attention to what really matters. He sat down at his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote a line he wanted to remember. Courage is the moment you stop asking for permission to be yourself. He smiled, knowing that even if he never boarded another plane, the journey would stay with him. He closed the notebook, letting the quiet of the evening fill his room, and knew the ripples would keep moving far beyond anything he could see. The days after the flight were quieter, but Jordan could feel the echoes everywhere he went. School resumed and the routines returned: late bells, rushed homework, cafeteria chatter. But something had changed, both in him and in the world around him. He moved through the halls with a new sense of awareness. Some students avoided his eyes, others nodded with respect, and a few even reached out to say they had followed the story online. His teachers seemed more attentive, and a few classmates confided in him about times they, too, had felt unseen or out of place. Dr. Carter checked in every afternoon, sometimes with a simple text, "You okay, Joe," and sometimes in person, bringing sandwiches and a steady, grounding presence. Jordan's mother, Nadine, had become a little more protective, but she also watched him with pride, careful to give him space to process it all on his own terms. At first, Jordan thought he could return to being just another student, blending back into the background, but it was impossible to go back to what he was before. The events on that flight and the days that followed had carved out a new part of him, a part that refused to shrink or apologize for existing. A week after the flight, the school principal announced that Jordan had been selected to represent the district at the upcoming National Youth Leadership Summit. The application had been sent in months ago, long before any of this happened. But now the invitation felt like an affirmation that he had something important to share. One morning, as he walked into the library, Jordan was greeted by a display news clippings, quotes from his story, and a photo of him boarding the plane, backpack slung over one shoulder, head held high. The caption beneath read, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 2A. Jordan stopped in front of the display, heart pounding. He remembered the fear he had felt in that seat, the helplessness and the determination that had risen up when he realized he could not just let it go. He wondered how many other kids had sat in their own version of seat 2A, feeling the same mix of hope and isolation. Later that afternoon, during a break in the school day, he sat with Eleanor Page in a sunlit courtyard. She was on campus for a guest lecture, having been invited to speak about her own experience as a lifelong educator and civil rights advocate. She smiled when she saw him, her face creased with warmth and pride. "You changed things, you know," she said, offering him a cup of tea. "I've been teaching for over 50 years. I've seen how slowly the world moves, but sometimes it only takes one person to speed it up." Jordan smiled, a little embarrassed by the attention. "I did not want to make a scene," he admitted. "I just wanted to be treated the same as anyone else." Eleanor nodded. "And in doing so, you reminded everyone else what that actually means." As the summit approached, Jordan spent long nights writing and rewriting what he wanted to say. He did not want his story to be about pain or anger alone. He wanted it to be about possibility, the chance for anyone, anywhere, to refuse invisibility, even in the smallest moments. He wanted to talk about Ms. Sloan, too, about the way dignity can be restored on both sides when people are willing to face the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. On the day of the summit, the auditorium was filled with students from across the country. Some were nervous, others excited. The air hummed with anticipation. When it was his turn, Jordan took a steadying breath, stepped to the microphone, and looked out at the faces waiting for him to speak. He began not with the flight, but with a memory from childhood, the first time he realized some people would judge him before he even said a word. He spoke about the lessons his mother taught him about the power of kindness and the cost of silence. He described the fear and the shame that sometimes accompanied being seen, and the courage it took not to disappear in those moments. Then he told them about seat 2A. He did not sensationalize. He spoke simply and honestly, describing how it felt to be skipped, to be dismissed, to have to decide whether or not to make himself visible. He spoke about the fear of being labeled a troublemaker, about the hesitation to speak up when the world seemed to prefer that he stay quiet. But then he spoke about what happened next, the small acts of solidarity, the strength that comes from knowing someone believes you matter, and the importance of even one person bearing witness. He shared how Eleanor, Chris, Aaliyah, and even Officer Ray had helped him feel less alone. He acknowledged Ms. Sloan, not as a villain, but as someone who was learning, just as he was. At the end of his speech, Jordan looked out at the audience and said, "I do not want to be remembered for what happened to me on a plane. I want to be remembered for refusing to disappear. I hope each of you will remember that, too. Speak up, not just for yourself, but for the person in seat 2A, wherever you find them." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting to become something more. There was no applause at first, just the sound of people thinking, of hearts being changed. Then, slowly, hands began to come together, the applause rising until it filled the hall. Afterward, dozens of students approached him, some with stories of their own, others with thanks or questions. Jordan realized that his courage had made space for others to find their voices. The ripple effect, Dr. Carter had called it, and now Jordan could see it moving outward, one conversation at a time. In the weeks that followed, the airline implemented new policies, mandatory anti-bias training for all crew, new reporting protocols for complaints, and a student advisory panel to consult on passenger experience. News outlets covered these changes, crediting Jordan's story with inspiring a shift not just at one company, but across the industry. Jordan received a letter from Ms. Sloan, handwritten and sincere. She apologized again, but also thanked him for holding her accountable. "I am learning to see what I missed." She wrote, "I hope to earn forgiveness, not just from you, but from every passenger I meet in the future." The letter meant more to Jordan than any headline. It was proof that even small acts of courage can bring about healing, not just for oneself, but for others. 2. One Saturday morning, Jordan and Dr. Carter visited a small local museum where the city's civil rights stories were displayed. In a quiet corner, there was now an exhibit, a replica of a first-class airplane seat, a folded napkin with the words, "You deserve better," written across it, and a plaque that read, "Dedicated to those who refuse to disappear." Jordan stood for a long time in front of the exhibit, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He thought about all the moments that brought him here, the doubt, the fear, the choice to be seen. Dr. Carter stood beside him, hand resting on Jordan's shoulder. "This is where change begins," he said, "with one person, one seat, one refusal to be silent." Jordan smiled, knowing he would carry the lesson of seat 2A with him wherever he went, in every room, on every journey, and wherever he saw someone overlooked or made to feel small, he would remember to speak up, to make space, and to honor the quiet, unyielding courage it takes to be seen. What does it truly mean to see someone and to be seen today? We watched a quiet act of courage ripple across an airplane and out into the world, forcing strangers, executives, and even those closest to us to confront the harm of casual prejudice. Jordan's journey reminds us that the loudest voice isn't always the one that shouts, but sometimes the one that simply refuses to disappear. His story is a call to pay attention, to speak up, and to never underestimate the quiet power of dignity. Every small act matters, every moment of allyship counts, and every assumption challenged can open the door to change. As we reflect on this powerful story, ask yourself, whose voice have you overlooked? Whose seat have you failed to protect? And will you have the courage to do better the next time you see injustice, no matter how quiet it seems? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's create a community where every seat is earned, every voice is valued, and no one is left unseen. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire justice, compassion, and hope. Thank you for watching.